Hello and welcome to ONTV's Fantasy Football League. I am the commish, Joe Johnson, flying solo this week. I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving weekend. With the Monday night game between the Packers and the Eagles, that wraps up Week 12 in fantasy football. And looks like the playoff bracket in our league is pretty much set. We'll see how it goes next week. But let's go to the scoreboard and recap Week 12, starting off with the game between the Blockbusters, my team, and King Kaloje. And I was hoping for an upset in this game, but as you can see, it just was not even close. As a matter of fact, it was pretty much over on Thanksgiving Day. King Kaloje Ant started Kirk Cousins on Thanksgiving against Dallas, and I did not expect him to put up 40 points on that Thanksgiving Day game. Look at that, 449 yards passing against the Dallas Cowboys and 3 touchdowns. Really impressive performance from Kirk Cousins, who has been performing like that all season long. There was some quarterback controversy earlier in the season, some unrest in the locker room, but Kirk Cousins has really proven himself on the field. And look at those numbers that he's put up all season long. 40 points this week, 36 last week. He's been really, really consistent. Would have been a great steal in the draft. Once Kirk put up 40 points on Thanksgiving, it was all but over for me. LaShawn McCoy against Jacksonville, 27 points, 20 points from Le'Veon Bell, Pittsburgh Steelers running back against the Indianapolis Colts, for a total of 127 points, which are pretty big numbers in our league. Over on the other side of the ball, 77 points. A lot of single digits. My stud of the game was Matt Ryan, who I was debating whether or not to start Eli Manning, who was on my bench facing a terrible Cleveland team. But Eli only outscored Matt Ryan by about 4 points. So Matt Ryan was my high scorer, 23 points against Arizona. Let's see what Matt put up total. He had 269 yards and 2 touchdowns. Both of them to the same wide receiver, who we'll talk about more a little bit later. Odell Beckham had a nice game. Unfortunately, he had a kickoff return for a touchdown called back on a holding penalty, and from what I hear, it was a phantom holding penalty. But not only was I killed by a bunch of single-digit performances, but look at my Rams defense. I did not expect them to put up the dud that they put up against the Saints. I know Breeze has been playing well, but so have the Rams defense and special teams. But they gave up 49 points on Sunday, which was a net total of negative 5 points, which was absolutely brutal. And that, when you consider the negative 5 points includes some turnovers and sacks and things like that, it was just an absolute overall brutal performance by my Rams defense. Really heartbreaking and disappointing. I don't think anything on my bench would have made much of a difference. Like I said, Eli Manning only outscored Ryan by 4 points. Terrell Pryor had a good game. He's been very consistent in Cleveland, despite the fact that Cleveland's been losing all season. Pryor's been playing well. He produced 13 points. And Jordan Howard, Chicago Bears running back, who actually has been performing pretty well, put up 12 points against Tennessee. And we're going to talk about Jordan Howard a little bit later in the second half of the program on whether or not you should start him in Week 13. As far as Ant's bench, nothing would have made much of a difference there. Dante Moncrief, 10 points on the bench. But another powerful performance by King Kaloje Ant, who I believe has won 4 in a row. I think he has the longest win streak in our league. Let's move on to the next game. Undeflated versus Team Witherspoon. Witherspoon has hit the skids. I think he's lost at least 3 games in a row. He was a powerhouse early on in the season, but he's been struggling as of late. I think he's still pretty much guaranteed to make the playoffs, though, so no harm, no foul. Undeflated put up 122 points, 26 from Brady. Let's look at his stat line. 286 yards passing, 2 touchdowns for a total of 26 points. against the Jets, which is pretty much expected. The Jets have not been playing well at all this season, and I think we predicted last week that Brady was going to go in and have a pretty solid game. David Johnson, another steal of the draft. Very, very consistent. Look at the points along the side there. 20-point games, 130-point games, pretty consistently. He had 13 carries for 58 yards, but I believe he also had a touchdown reception. Yeah. So 8 catches for 103 yards. Is that right? And a touchdown reception. So David Johnson's been playing really, really well and helping the undeflated perform. And let's look at Mike Evans, another guy we seem to be talking about week after week after week is the Tampa Bay Bucs wide receiver Mike Evans. He's been pretty consistent. You can see there's been a couple of single-digit games, but for the most part, it's been all double digits. And against Seattle, which traditionally has been a difficult defense, he had 8 catches for 104 yards and 2 touchdowns to produce 22 points to help Joe Velez get the win. Over on the other side of the ball, Drew Brees against the LA Rams defense. As I said earlier, LA Rams have been playing pretty decent defense. I've started them all season long and have gotten pretty consistent points, but for some reason, Brees just picked them apart. 310 yards, 4 touchdowns, plus that's 4 passing touchdowns. He also had a quarterback sneak for an additional touchdown to produce 42 points. And again, look at those numbers. That's his, third 40-point game of the season. He's had several 30-point games, several 20-point games. Drew Brees is definitely one of the top quarterbacks in fantasy. Definitely an elite, and I think he's pretty much clinched his place in the Hall of Fame. Let's see, running back Jonathan Stewart is back, and after 3 underperforming games, as you can see there, he finally put up some decent numbers again, 21 points, 96 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Oakland Raiders in a really exciting game. I hope you caught that one over the weekend. That was a fun game to watch. So 21 points from Jonathan Stewart, and then Latavius Murray added 14. Would the bench have made any difference? Not really. Actually, Undeflated left more points on the bench than Witherspoon did. Just single digits on Witherspoon's bench. Matt Stafford, who was outscored by Brady, produced 20 points. And then Brandon Marshall with the Jets produced 12 points. So the bench wouldn't have made much of a difference. Let's move on to the next game here. Let's go to Reawakening versus the Irish Brogues. And low-scoring game, but you can see that the Irish Brogues pulled out the victory with 94 points. And always frustrating when somebody gets the win in a low-scoring affair. First, let's look at the Reawakening score. Ben Roethlisberger had a decent game, 29 points against the Colts. I think we predicted that. The Colts defense has been pretty soft. 221 yards, 3 touchdowns to produce 29 points. And a lot of single digits from Reawakening. Really tough weekend for Reawakening. And minus 2 points from the usually reliable Adam Vinatieri. Minus 2 negative points from his kicker. That's got to hurt. Irish Brogues had a decent week. Didn't break 3 digits, but scored enough points to win. 24 points from Dak Prescott, another player we seem to talk about every single week on this show. And this is kind of a down week for Dak Prescott. As you can see, he almost consistently over the past 4 weeks has scored 30-plus points. And every week before that, he's been in the 20s. Just a huge steal in the draft. I don't know if anyone expected this rookie to come in here and produce like he has, but he put up 195 points in a passing TD, and he also had a rushing TD, which helped pad his score a little bit. And then on Antonio Brown, who overall during the season has been a little on the quiet side, but as you can see here, he's produced double-digit points. No monster scores, but as a matter of fact, this past week was his biggest score of the game on the Thanksgiving night. He caught 3 touchdowns 5 catches, 91 yards, 3 touchdowns for 27 points on Thanksgiving. So that was sort of the dessert for Antonio Brown owners on Thanksgiving night, which helped lead the Irish Brogues to a win. A lot of single digits there. Amari Cooper, who's been normally pretty reliable, only scored 2 points against Carolina. That's really surprising. Bills' defense against Jacksonville, only 2 points. Let's take a look at the benches. Mark Ingram. Ooh, that's got to hurt. Reawakening has left Mark Ingram on the bench against L.A., who scored 28 points. He had a monster game against L.A. Let's take a look at his stat line. 14 rushes for 146 yards and a rushing score. And did he have I think he had a receiving touchdown too, because it says here he scored twice for the second time in 4 weeks. So yeah, he had a pretty good game on the weekend against that normally tough Rams defense. Derek Carr didn't outscore Ben Roethlisberger. Kelsey scored double digits, 10 points, but maybe with a couple of tweaks, Reawakening could have pulled off the victory. He had left quite a bit of points on his bench, but it was Team Irish Brogues that came up with the win. And let's look at our final matchup, the Thrashers versus Atwater. This was a pretty high-scoring affair, 130 versus 103. And let's look at Thrasher's score. His stud of the game was Aaron Rodgers, who, we've mentioned this before on this show. The critics have been tough on Aaron Rodgers, but as far as fantasy football goes, look at those numbers. It's amazing to think that the Packers have been on a 6-game losing streak before the Monday night game, but look at the numbers he's put up during that losing streak. 31 points against Chicago, 44 against Atlanta, 33, 32, and 38. Now, a lot of those points probably came on garbage time touchdowns, but despite the fact that the Packers as a unit they've been underperforming, Rodgers has been producing pretty consistently in fantasy football. So he was the stud of Valhalla, the Thrashers squad there. And then look at the Giants defense, and this was definitely a smart play on Ian Locke's part to start the Giants defense against Cleveland. Cleveland, wow, they're shooting for that Detroit Lions consecutive loss in a season record. They came up with another loss against the Giants, but the Giants defense put up 25 points, 3 fumble recoveries. They even scored a touchdown when they intercepted the ball and returned that in for a touchdown. So 25 points from the Giants defense. Smart move. Over on the other side, Atwater got a victory with 130 points. His stud of the game was Phillip Rivers against Houston. He put up 27 points, had another multiple touchdown performance, 3 touchdowns, 242 yards. Rivers has been a really nice fantasy quarterback this year. You pretty much were able to just plug him in and let him go, and you knew you were going to get points from him. Ezekiel Elliott, another perennial guy that we talk about just about every episode of ONTV's Fantasy Football League. 97 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns to produce 23 points. He's definitely been not only a fantasy star, but a star in the NFL. And on Monday night, Devontae Adams, another pretty big game. 5 catches, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns on Monday night against the Eagles. So he's been a pretty nice points producer in fantasy. Let's bring up the bench, which I almost hate to do spare the Thrashers some pain here, but look at those points on the bench. But he's in the control room groaning. But really, in his defense, would you have started Tyreek Hill against that Denver defense? He put up 27 points. Let's look at his stat line. 9 catches, 52 yards, and a touchdown for 27 points. And he was the first player with a rushing touchdown, a receiving touchdown, and scored on a kick return in a single game since Gale Sayers did it in 1965. And Ian sat on his couch and watched Tyreek Hill break that record on his bench.
I think I cried.
Yeah, that had to generate some tears. Michael Thomas, New Orleans wide receiver, he's been kind of up and down all season long, but against, again, the usually stout LA defense, he's put up 9 catches for 108 yards and 2 touchdowns for 22 points. So, yeah, definitely a couple of tweaks. And, Ian, I think you said you're going to start a couple of those guys this week, right?
Yeah, last week I'm pouring them all in.
All right. Might as well be a spoiler at the end of the season and try and hand your next opponent a loss. Over on Atwater's team, not too many points on the bench. Emmanuel Sanders, who last week John was on the show, and we had sort of given up on Emmanuel Sanders. We pretty much declared him a fantasy disappointment. And I don't know if it was a result of that conversation, but John ended up benching Emmanuel Sanders. And he must have got the message, because he had 7 catches for 162 yards and a touchdown against Kansas City for 22 points. So that's fantasy football for you. You give up on a player and he turns around and puts up some big numbers. Phillip Rivers outscored Cam Newton, so no points lost there. So as if we look at the standings real quick, Undeflated is leading the East Division with a 7-5 record. I'm 2 games back. Over in the West, Ann has been dominating the later half of the season. He has a 9-3 record, pretty much guaranteed to make the playoffs. And Witherspoon and Irish Brogues right now have the 3-4 seed. And Atwater is hoping to get a win paired with a loss from one of the other teams, and he might have an outside shot at the playoffs. So we're going to take a quick break here, and we're going to make some predictions for Week 13. We're going to look at some fantasy matchups and look at a preview of our playoff standing. We'll be right back after this break.
Residents are invited to line the streets of downtown Lake Orion on Saturday, December 3rd at 6 p.m. for the 2016 Orion Area Lighted Christmas Parade. The parade starts at Blanche Sims Elementary School and travels north on Broadway before coming to an end at the Eamon Center. More than 75 community groups, including scouts, dignitaries, and marching bands, will entertain spectators of all ages. And of course, Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus will appear in person to usher in the holiday season and will attend a meet and greet at Village Hall after the parade. If you'd like to participate in the parade or for more information, including the parade route, visit orionlightedparade.org.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
And welcome back to ONTV's Fantasy Football League. I'm Joe Johnson. Now we're going to go ahead, as we do every week, and look at matchups, fantasy matchups in the next week, in this case Week 13, which is the final regular week of our season. You can see some of the matchups courtesy of NFL.com. Ranking 32nd, dead last overall in fantasy, are the San Francisco 49ers. They're playing at 1 o'clock against the Bears. If you have any Bears players, you might want to consider playing them. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. Ranked 31st overall are the Atlanta Falcons. They're going to be hosting the Kansas City Chiefs. Cleveland, they're on a much-needed bye. They deserve a week of rest. Ranked 29th, the Colts are going to be traveling to New York to take on the Jets. And ranked 28th, the Packers are going to be hosting Houston. And ranked 27th, Carolina is going to be traveling to Seattle. Now let's break it down by by skill position, starting with the quarterback. Ranked dead last against quarterbacks, somewhat surprisingly, are the Atlanta Falcons. They're going to be taking on Kansas City. They're going to be hosting Kansas City. Alex Smith is once again under center for Kansas City. Did not have a monster game against Denver, which is to be expected last week. Denver has a pretty darn good defense. He had 220 yards and 1 touchdown. If you're heading into your playoffs and you're thinking of starting Alex Smith, I don't know how you got to the playoffs. If Alex Smith is going to produce, this is going to be the week to do it. But I can't imagine anyone who's owned Alex Smith is sniffing the playoffs right now. Ranked 31st against quarterbacks are the Indianapolis Colts. They're going to be taking on the New York Jets. Ryan Fitzpatrick faced the New England Patriots last week and had a decent game, 269 yards, 2 touchdowns, but he also lost a fumble. Against Indy, if you have Ryan in your starting lineup, you may want to consider starting him. As I mentioned earlier, Cleveland's on a bye. They were ranked 30th against quarterbacks. Next up, San Francisco 49ers traveling to Chicago. Cutler did not play in Week 12. Instead, Matt Barkley came in and got the start and had a very impressive game. 316 yards, 3 touchdowns, even though he did throw 2 interceptions against Tennessee. But coming in with his first game, he had a pretty impressive performance. So if you have, you probably don't have Barkley on your roster. Would I suggest him as a waiver wire pickup? Maybe if you're desperate. So consider starting Barkley if you're desperate for a quarterback. Ranked 28th is Carolina against quarterbacks. They're going to be traveling to Seattle, and I expect Russell Wilson to have a pretty decent game. Now, last week he was a little flat against a matchup that people were expecting better things. He faced Tampa Bay last week and only threw for 151 yards and 0 TDs and 2 INTs against Tampa Bay. A really shocking performance. Now, will he turn things around against Carolina? Possibly, but do you want your chances of reaching the playoffs hinging on whether Russell Wilson shows up to play? I'd be really nervous about starting Wilson this week. Ranked 27th, Detroit Lions. This is going to be painful. Ranked 27th against quarterbacks are the Lions. Who's coming to town? Drew Brees and the New Orleans Saints. This is a recipe for disaster. The Lions, as you probably know, each of their last 7 games, I think it is, they headed into the fourth quarter down, only to come back and win the game. Will they do that against the Saints? I find that very hard to believe. Last week, Brees had a career game, 310 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, plus that quarterback sneak for a touchdown against the Rams defense. If you have Brees in your starting lineup this week, you could pretty much guarantee that you're going to coast into the playoffs on his performance. I expect him to put up monster numbers against the Detroit Lions. Let's move on to running backs. Ranked dead last against San Francisco, against running backs ranked dead last to San Francisco. They're going to be traveling to Chicago. Jordan Howard's been a bit of a pleasant surprise. He hasn't had any touchdowns since Week 8 against Minnesota, but he has had 4 100-yard games since taking over that starting role in Chicago. So considering that San Francisco was ranked dead last, I would definitely put Jordan Howard in my starting lineup and expect big things from Howard. Ranked 31st against ranked 31st against quarterbacks are the Atlanta Falcons. They're going to be taking on Kansas City, who they don't have much of a run game at all anymore. Spencer Ware has not scored a touchdown since Week 6. He's only averaging 65 yards per game since he returned to action following a concussion. Even though these numbers say start your Kansas City Chiefs running backs, the Kansas City Chiefs are a team to steer clear of, especially heading down the home stretch in your fantasy football season. Ranked 30th against running backs, Pittsburgh Steelers. They're going to be taking on the New York Giants, who also has been struggling in the run game. Rashad Jennings, facing Cleveland last week, only produced 55 yards. That's pretty disappointing, and he only has 2 total touchdowns on the season. I would expect the Giants to beat Pittsburgh next week, but not on the ground. I think they're going to do it in the air. Again, Cleveland is on a bye. Ranked 28th are the Colts. They're going to be taking on the Jets. Do you consider starting Matt Forte, who only produced 27 yards against New England? I'd be nervous about that, especially at this point in the season. I might consider starting Bilal Powell, who can also be a factor in the passing game. So if you have to start Powell, I might avoid Forte. And ranked 27th against the run, San Diego Chargers are going to be taking on Tampa Bay, who has Doug Martin, who's been playing fairly well after coming back from injury. He had 87 yards against Seattle, even though he did lose a fumble and he didn't get into the end zone. He missed 6 games. So one advantage that Doug Martin has is fresh legs, and I expect him to have a monster game against San Diego. As a matter of fact, that game's going to be fun to watch. Rivers versus Jameson Winston. I think there's going to be a lot of scoring in that game. All right, let's move on to wide receivers. Ranked dead last against wide receivers are the Kansas City Chiefs. They're going to be traveling to Atlanta. Now, you might think Julio Jones is the play here, but he only had 35 yards against Arizona. The guy you want to start next week, if he's still available on the waiver wire, I would grab him on the waiver wire, is Taylor Gabriel. Last week against Arizona, he caught 4 passes for 75 yards and 2 touchdowns to help out the Falcons in that game. So if Gabriel's on the waiver wire, I'm sure people are going to be going after him. I would start Julio Jones and I would start Taylor Gabriel this week if you're really battling for a playoff position. Ranked 31st against wide receivers, San Francisco 49ers. They're traveling to Chicago. Cam Meredith, he only had 2 catches for 19 yards against Tennessee last week. Surprisingly, this is a name we haven't mentioned on this show yet. Marquez Wilson caught 8 balls for 125 yards and a touchdown in his second game back from injury. People are saying this guy's the real deal. So if he's available on your waiver wire, pick up Wilson and start him this week. Tennessee's on a bye, ranked 29th against wide receivers are the Oakland Raiders. And they're going to be playing, they're going to be hosting Buffalo this week. And guess who is back in Buffalo? Sammy Watkins, who I drafted in all my leagues. And because of injury, he was one of the biggest disappointments from draft day. But he is back and he seems to be playing well. And he missed 8 total games. Last week he had 3 catches for 80 yards, including 1 catch that went 62 yards. I'm sure I've cut him in all my leagues, so he's probably available on the waiver wire. So I would pick up Sammy Watkins and consider starting him against the Oakland Raiders. That should be interesting. Ranked 28th is Chicago versus San Francisco. If you're going to start one wide receiver from San Francisco, I would consider starting Torrey Smith, who had 2 catches for 24 yards and a TD. But it's only his 3rd touchdown of the season, so that would be a little bit of a risky play. And finally, ranked 27th against wide receivers, the LA Rams, who were burnt against New Orleans last week and Drew Brees. Guess who they're facing this week? Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. So if you have Edelman or even Chris Hogan, you want to start these guys this week. Edelman had 8 catches for 83 yards against the Jets, and he scored against San Francisco in Week 11. Chris Hogan, who I mentioned, had 4 catches for 70 yards. I would feel comfortable starting either one of those guys next week as you're trying to advance into the playoffs. Now, if you play those weekly fantasy games where you start a new lineup every week, here are my suggestions for a possible perfect lineup. Start Drew Brees as your quarterback. Consider starting as your running backs Jordan Howard and Doug Martin. I expect both of those guys to have monster games. In the wide receiver position, Gabriel with the Falcons. Take a chance on Marquez Wilson. You might be able to get him really, really cheaply in those daily fantasy leagues. And we didn't talk about some of these other positions, but Colby Fleener against the Lions, who I think are ranked 31st against tight ends. Start Colby Fleener. I think he's going to have a monster game against the Lions. Start possibly the Denver kicker, McManus. And start the Denver defense this week if you're looking for the perfect lineup. So those are our predictions for next week. Let's take quickly, we're running out of time. Let's look at next week. We got Smoke on the Atwater taking on the Hollywood Blockbusters. That's me. If he secures a win, that he might sneak into the playoffs. So that's there's gonna be a lot riding on that game. King Kaloje Ant taking on the Undeflated. Looks like Ant is favored in that game, which is expected. He's been dominating the past several weeks. Witherspoon taking on Reawakening, and Team Irish Brogues taking on the Thrashers. We will return in week 13 to recap the results, see who made the playoffs, and good luck. Hope you make the playoffs next week, and we'll be back. We'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Good night.